barrister, Stanford Jose. Well, my profession is a jurisconsult, basically, which is a specialist in jurisprudence. And jurisprudence is the science and the philosophy of law, and in particular how we look at law, how it gets applied in the real world. I trained as a barrister, but am non-practicing, didn't go through the full stage of becoming a barrister, because part of the reason why I wanted to become a barrister was because of the notion of the power of law in affecting change. And when I was actually doing my legal education and training, I remember one of my law professors basically saying, this is all theory what we're doing here. In practice it doesn't work like this. And so I've actually spent most of my adult life engaged in what's called legal literacy, which is really enabling those who have not formally been schooled in law to understand their role not only in law implementation but shaping and making of law, and in particular challenging unjust law. So yes, my work really focuses around raising legal consciousness so that we can understand how we can use law as a tool of resistance and liberation, because it has often been misused as a tool of oppression. So it's quite a specialist field, because even within conventional law there are many different schools, and I come from a school of law that's called critical law, which basically looks at law in its social, political and economic context, as opposed to what's traditionally called black letter law, which is very much the law of the statute books, as though it's come from on high, and we have no role in actually changing it, in shaping it or translating it. And the history of our people, and certainly our liberation struggle, is that we have shaped law. We have been makers of law. We have broken unjust laws in order to bring about a more just situation.
And that leads us neatly into my next question, really, which was, define reparations, the principles of reparations in the context of the journey of African people.
Well, reparations, in terms of the word, it really sort of comes from the French réparer, and it has kind of three interconnected meanings: to restore, to make amends, and also to renew, and to repair. So essentially, reparations is commonly understood as repairing harm, damage, wrongs, injuries to individuals, peoples and groups that have been affected by various forms of oppression or violations of their human and or people's rights. So that's the basic definition and understanding of reparations. Within our people's struggle for liberation and to restore ourselves, reparations has come to represent not only a political struggle and a legal claim or a case, but more significantly a social movement to actually restore us as a people, as in fact a nation, to our rightful place on this planet as mothers and fathers of human civilization. So the reparations movement, as it's commonly called today, is really a global, what's called social movement, which is aimed to bring about social change, social transformation, and to repair some of the damage that we have experienced as a result of enslavement and colonialism and their shared legacies which remain with us today.
That's quite a comprehensive overview of reparations, because a lot of people will simplify it as just down to monetary return. What would you say to that?
Well, that has become an approach to reparations that's in particular been very common in the last, I'd say, 20 or 30 years. And there's different phases in the reparations movement, if you like. And that's one of the more modern phase, where we've become sort of very engrossed in a global economic system that's really based on capitalism. And that has also defined many of the strategies for liberation that we seek to take. Now, compensation is only one aspect of reparation. So it's an aspect that has become overemphasized in modern times, and I wouldn't dismiss it totally. However, it is not the most significant part of reparations. Also, I believe that the mass media, the corporate global neoliberal mass media, has had a huge role to play in actually creating this situation in the public consciousness that reparations is synonymous with money, because it also serves a particular agenda of the powers that be to actually create an impression that all we want is a bunch of money, to actually turn people away from supporting the cause of reparations and truly actually working in solidarity with us, as has always been the case throughout our freedom struggle. Our freedom struggle has always garnered the support of non-Africans who were conscientious and who saw the righteousness and the rightness of what we were seeking to do. Now, there is something called the International Framework on Reparations, which is some international principles which are based on, they're actually called the Van Boven Principles, and they look at what reparations are in a holistic way. And these are principles which have been embraced by the United Nations, and there are 5 key strands to these principles in terms of an international framework on the right to a remedy of reparations for victims of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian rights. Now, the 5 key strands are restitution, which is basically to put a thing, a people, a group back in the position they would have been in had the various violations of their rights not occurred.
Yes.
So in our situation, we're talking about had enslavement and colonialism not occurred, that would be restitution. How do we reclaim everything that has been stolen from us, everything that has been taken from us, and everything that we have lost? There is also rehabilitation, which is quite self-explanatory, but it also includes, the various social welfare reforms that we need and redress to actually rebuild ourselves, re-establish ourselves, looking at social support, even legal services and support, various kinds of provision to do with meeting the everyday, like, basic needs of people. And oftentimes we think of rehabilitation within a specific context of psychological rehabilitation and so forth. There is also compensation, which is basically any kind of loss that we can put a financial value on. So it's not just a simple monetary sum. Compensation can be in money, or it can be in other resources, real property, land, restoration of rights to trade, and that's particularly important, say, in the Caribbean, where we've been particularly affected in terms of, unjust rules of international trade, what's happened to the banana industry, the sugar industry, and how that's had such a huge impact on development, or so-called development, in the Caribbean. Then there's also something called satisfaction, which are all the measures that we would put in place to feel satisfied that we have had some measure of redress, that we've had the correct story told, that the correct narrative remains in the public arena as to what's happened and who were the perpetrators and who were the victims, if you like. So it includes things like commemoration days, changing the names of buildings and landmarks, changing the curriculum, really teaching the truth about a people's journey and their struggle for liberation. So whereas in our freedom struggle, many of those who resisted oppression and enslavement were actually deemed to be terrorists and were deemed to be basically outlaws.
Now, mentally insane.
Exactly. Now that there's a kind of retelling of that and a correction of the narrative. So many of those who were hanged, many of those who were executed for actually engaging in their lawful rights to resist oppression now become celebrated heroes and heroines, etc. The final aspect of these international principles are something called non-repetition. And basically that's a very key aspect of our reparation struggle that has been extremely de-emphasized, because non-repetition basically speaks to all the measures that we put in place to ensure that this never happens again. Enslavement never happens again. Colonialism never happens again. Dispossession of our land and our resources never happens again. Quite clearly, that is happening again. People are still actually being sold into slavery today in terms of chattel slavery. Africans are still being sold into slavery. Our lands are still being stolen from us. Africa is in fact being recolonized. So non-repetition actually speaks to the various measures, and it includes things like holding perpetrators to account.
Yes.
So those are the 5 key strands of a holistic understanding of what reparations entail.
Okay, now you mentioned the word rehabilitation. You struck a chord with me. You also mentioned rehabilitation and used the word psychology in that as well. Now I know there's been quite a lot of research done on post-traumatic slavery syndrome.
Yes. What's
your view on that in terms of rehabilitation, and how can that be implemented as well?
Yes, I mean it's very, very relevant. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome, post-traumatic colonial syndrome, intergenerational Stockholm syndrome, which many of us seem to have, where we over-identify and have this false sense of loyalty to our oppressors and our colonizers. These are psychological legacies that very much disaffect us today as a people and as various individuals within our global nation to different degrees. Even some of us who come across quite well adjusted, I think, have different degrees of this syndrome unless we're constantly working to actually rehabilitate ourselves. So it's extremely relevant, and we know, you know, again in our freedom struggle, we've always emphasized not only the physical enslavement, but actually the mental enslavement. And if you like, that's the more pernicious form of enslavement today, simply because it's the hardest to tackle. At least with physical enslavement, chattel slavery, bondage and so forth, we can see it. It's very visible. But with the mental enslavement, many of us who appear to be normal and well adjusted and even get held up as being people to emulate in our community are actually some of the most mentally enslaved people. So it's very, very relevant. In terms of how it fits in, there has been a very well-defined, well-established constituency of mental health workers, psychologists, psychotherapists, those who kind of deal with the mental sciences, as it were, who have brought these perspectives into the reparations movement and have spoken of the importance of us actually being able to rehabilitate ourselves from mental slavery, to actually reclaim our authentic African mind, because that is what is most under attack today, and that can actually be a key component of our reparations movement as we move forward. Practically, how would it work? There are various strategies to effecting reparations. A common strategy that is, you know, again quite dominant in modern times is litigation. And so there's been various court cases. Many of them have not won in that kind of conventional sense of winning. However, a kind of claim for psychological repair can actually form parts of any litigation strategies. There's also political strategies. There's what we call the legislative strategies, which are actually more effective, where offending governments actually enact legislation as a form of recompense and redress. And there is also the international movement building, which again has to accompany any of the litigation and the political and the legislative strategies too. So, for instance, we could argue that in order to help repair ourselves, we should have access to culturally appropriate psychological therapies as individuals, within our families and within the wider community. Now that is extremely winnable, because we have, certainly in the UK and in other sections of the West where we are dislocated basically, you find an overrepresentation of people of African origin in mental health service provision. It's actually a huge area of civil rights struggle in the UK at this time. And so if we had our mental health experts and professionals really getting on board the reparations movement, they can actually assist us with providing us with local and regional and national data that we can actually use as a tool to lobby the government, to lobby institutions for change. Because basically this is a very real, concrete legacy of enslavement today.
Well, it seems like a very complex issue, because if some in our community haven't actually acknowledged or taken ownership that they are not operating from within an African mindset, how do you then begin to get to a person like that? And to broaden the question out, would you say that African descendants in the diaspora are in a grip of a Western mindset?
Yes, most definitely we are. I mean, from the time we're born, for those, a lot of us don't go to school, but a lot of us do. The schooling that we receive, it's all Eurocentric. Everything that we learn actually is about Eurocentrism. Basic literacy, numeracy, the frameworks are Eurocentric, all the examples, and then when we go into high school or secondary school, the disciplines that we take up, science, maths and humanities and all kinds of sociology and history, a lot of the disciplines are taught from a Eurocentric perspective. And even though there is inclusion, as they would say, it often happens in a very tokenistic way. So Black History Month, that's when we want to learn, or diversity seminars or what have you, or slavery. That they will recognise slavery, and it's often taught very badly, but what's not taught is who we were before enslavement. So yes, we would be in the, we are very much immersed in a Western mindset, and it's become so normal to us, and we have become very functional within it, to the point that we don't recognise that actually, and in fact we don't remember that we were someone else, that we have our own ways of doing things, because Eurocentrism also operates on the principle of putting itself as the universal standard. So it doesn't name itself, it doesn't define itself, it just becomes the objective standard of truth that we emulate. And so when we then start talking about Black history or any other history, that becomes a deviation from the norm. And we know that even the Black history stuff, the majority of our people don't embrace it. It's still very much done in a tokenistic way.
Is there a problem that that objective standard you mentioned is alive and kicking on the continent as well, which is affecting our leadership?
Of course, most definitely, because we're all affected by the same sickness. we have to recognise what happened during colonialism. You know, the missionaries, the mercenaries, the colonial schooling that many of our people in Africa and the Caribbean received. Those mission schools were actually schools teaching European indoctrination.
Yes.
They kind of tell us it was about civilization, basically civilizing the natives, bringing us into the modern world, you know, getting rid of some of our backward ways. But actually it was European indoctrination and propaganda. And part of that schooling that we received, and it wasn't only formal schooling, it was the informal schooling, because part of colonialism was about actually disrupting our whole social fabric, and it was actually a cultural genocide that we experienced. And in the framework of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who is the person, the Polish jurist who coined that term, he actually spoke of the imposition of the national, you know, pattern of the oppressor nation on the oppressed nation.
Yes.
That was actually the preliminary to a physical genocide. It was the cultural genocide. So that was then about instilling European norms, values, cultural frameworks, educational you know, notions, worldviews and so forth within all aspects of our society. So not only formal schooling, looking at social institutions, the world of work, the world of industry, technology, and in particular the role of spirit and belief.
Right.
That's the biggest place where, if you like, they've done this job on us. And in imposing their national way of life, that resulted in an attempt, they didn't quite succeed, to destroy our way of life. But we are a resilient people, and so we've always maintained some semblance of our identity and a memory of who we truly are. But it has been difficult to actually maintain that in a way that is systematic and actually can undo the structural legacies of colonialism that very much remain in Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora today. The mere fact, okay, we talk about independence, let's just say in the Caribbean, where many of us, you know, also have connections. The fact that many of these countries actually have Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state really kind of tells us what kind of independence. And we know that countries like Jamaica and Barbados have been having discussions around becoming republics. But even our judicial systems, the fact that we emulate the British judicial systems, their norms, their systems of justice and governance and Westminster parliamentary democracy, this is all part of it.
So there is a healing process required on the continent, because I think there's a kind of misunderstanding that the healing needs to take place amongst diasporians alone.
There is a misunderstanding. And there hasn't been, I feel, sufficient attention paid in recent times, in particular from so-called African leaders, to looking at redressing some of these legacies of colonialism. Because many of us have been deceived into this notion that we are free. And in a way that's only a half-truth, because if we look at it historically, when our ancestors were in chattel slavery, freedom might have looked like so-called emancipation, removing those chains.
Physical chains, yes.
But we know now, looking back, that that wasn't freedom. Yeah, that was just, you know, a changing
Releasing
of the guard, if you like.
Brains,
exactly.
Yes.
And it's the same thing. So yes, this need to embark on a holistic global healing and rediscovery and actually assessment of the damage that we're still continuing to be subjected to, but also actually that some of us are now becoming perpetrators of.
Yeah, that was my next question actually, because you kind of, you know, how do we embark on that holistic healing? I mean, has it begun from your perspective as a reparationist?
It's already begun.
Right.
The healing has already begun. Every generation has really sought to further the healing. You know, there is a very narrow understanding of healing that is, you know, something that we do, we take ourselves away from, we go and see a therapist or something like that, but there's actually a much deeper understanding of healing, which is tied to structural change and transformation. So in that broader sense of healing, which is to heal ourselves, which includes restoring ourselves, renewing ourselves, regenerating ourselves, and actually evolving ourselves, you know, eradicating some of these maladaptive tendencies and behavioural patterns and mindsets that we've internalized as a result of our oppression, to actually, you know, seeking to reclaim our humanity and our agency. How do we do it? Education is really important, and I'm not talking about formal education in schools. I'm talking about the broader context of education, drawing out of ourselves, which is within, you know, reconnecting with our inner selves, our spirit, if people want to call it that, our place, our sense of destiny, our sense of agency, our sense of being people who actually are not here by accident. That, you know, it's not a mistake of the Creator, that actually we are here on divine purpose. And
so there is the collective, but there's the individual taking on.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. And the collective healing is really many of the movements that have been throughout the ages to restore us. So the reparations movement really began from the time that our ancestors were kidnapped off the shores of Africa. The movement to restore, to reclaim, to restitute us, to rebuild us, to repair us began centuries ago. And throughout the generations we've kind of taken it up a notch. And that's where we are today. So I do feel ultimately, though, it will entail many of our, you know, political and civic leaders and spiritual leaders and community leaders actually understanding and engaging much more effectively, being much more proactive around what's currently called the reparations movement, because every generation has a phase.
Yes.
You know, Pan-Africanism is still there, but there was a time when it was, you know, the movement, just like civil rights movement, black power movement. Every stage of our history we've kind of encapsulated what our freedom struggle has been about, and in this current phase of our history, the movement is the reparations movement, which really encompasses all that has gone before. It doesn't replace it,
That's right.
It encompasses the whole.